Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this fifth Infrastructure in Tech coming out of COVID webinar event. We've had over 1,000 people register for our first 5 webinars, which I think is pretty good going. And we've got a really interesting panel set before us this morning to discuss what I think is a issue of communications in the new digital landscape. I think one of the real signals and one of the real things that we all sort of know about in relation to what we've been through over the last few months is that the world of communications has changed pretty drastically. We communicate as businesses and how we communicate as individuals, and the fact that we're all sat here watching a webinar, of course, webinars used to exist before we had COVID-19, but there's no question that the prevalence and the increase in use of this kind of technology has just gone through the roof over the course of this current crisis, and it obviously has changed the way in which we communicate, and that's what today's event is going to be all about. And we've got a really great panel to talk to us about some of these issues. We've got someone who's an expert in presentation. We've got a practitioner from one of the largest UK engineering consultancies operating at the present moment. We've got someone from a leading communications consultancy who we're very pleased to be working with on today's webinar. That's BECG. And we've also got a negotiations expert, because although we might not be able to meet in person, there's still going to be a lot of negotiations needing to take place in our industry, particularly around the contractual and legal side as we move out of this crisis. And we'll be getting some insights on the world of negotiations a little bit later on. But our first speaker is joining us, and we're really chuffed to have him all the way from New Zealand in Auckland, and that's Greg Ward. Now, Greg is a virtual and live MC. He's a TV presenter and a speaker, and he has been involved in presenting events and presentation roles across the world, and is going to talk to us, I think, a little bit about how we can do things better and how this whole online world is actually changing the way we work. So without further ado, over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy, and it's truly is a pleasure to be here with you, joining you virtually from the other side of the world. Fabulous stuff. I'd say kia ora koutou, which is a way of saying in Māori, a very warm welcome to you all. As Andy pointed out, the work that I do now is significantly virtual, whereas the vast majority of the work that I would have done prior to COVID was very much in the live environment, aside from the television elements. And something that has changed significantly for us is we have to become very swiftly competent in the technology side of the business. It's easy to sit here on the other side of the world in front of a camera quite comfortably, because this is my world. But for the vast majority of people, they've been thrust into a position of going from face-to-face working and having to move to remote locations, coming to grips with the technology, while at the same time trying to juggle lives through this COVID challenge. We're very fortunate in New Zealand that we're starting to come what feels towards the end of it, but we know that we've got a very long road ahead of us in terms of getting back to a normal, if a normal exists. It will be some form of new normal for us. For me, the transition was almost immediate over the course of a period of 2 weeks where I was in self-isolation after coming back from Australia. And in that 2-week period, almost every single piece of business that I had disappeared over the course of that 2-week period. But the beautiful thing about that was, while the work disappeared, the responsibility of doing that work also disappeared. So suddenly I'm left with this position of going, if money was no object, if time was no object, if there were no constraints, what would I do? And so from that process, it was it's quite a simple matter of going, okay, with the tools that I've got, how can I connect with people in this new world? So with a very simple webcam, with what essentially was a garage light on an orange lead with one of those little wire baskets over the front, stuck on a microphone stand just in front of me, and a laptop which was never designed to handle the amount of work that I was throwing at it. I began to work at how can I connect, and very soon I realized that the biggest part of this was audio. The thing about video is that we know we're going to get dropouts. We know that we're going to have bandwidth issues, and we'll forgive that very simply. But if you have poor audio, your audience is going to tune out very swiftly. And the other factor is that because we can't see our audiences, we don't know what our audience is doing. In fact, you may be standing and walking around in your environment right now, and you might not be able to see me on screen, but you'll be listening. And so that audio has to be absolutely crystal clear at the best rate that you can possibly achieve that. So very simply, and I've just as a little tip, what I'm doing with my environment here is I am using in-ear monitors, and when I say in-ear monitors, that sounds very technical. It's just a set of headphones, little set of earbuds, which I'm then plugging into a mixer. Very, very simple. But it means that the only sound in this environment is me. It's just my voice. I have a microphone just above me as well, so they're slightly out of shot, and I'm able to just keep that distance between me and my mic very close indeed. So again, it creates this sense of intimacy. And that's a really important point in this new playing field. If we're here and we're presenting, we're not presenting to hundreds of people or thousands of people. I'm speaking now to you, just to you, one person. It's a one-to-one relationship, but we don't often think about it in those terms. And so we have to maintain this energy flow between ourselves, that tiny pinhole of a camera that we have here, and imagine what's happening on the other side of the camera for the one individual that we are connecting with. It's that intimacy, but multiplied many, many, many times. So keeping those things in mind is really important. Maintaining an eye line with a camera is really important as well. Not that you're fixating on the camera, because we don't do that in real life either. We always have these moments where we're looking away. So I've broken these elements down in terms of presenting in these remote locations into three, what I'm calling the 3 pillars of remote presenting. And the first of those pillars is technology. So whatever you can do, whatever budget you can put towards it, the better you can get the tech, the better the experience is going to be. But it's not just about the technology. The second pillar is about design, creating presentation design or content design that enhances the retention of the content that you're trying to present across this medium. And the third element is behavior. How do you connect with people? What's the tools that we use? Now, in real life, we can see the people, and as a consequence, and all of us are very, very good consummate actors. If you're a trained actor, it just means you can replicate something, and you've delved into it kind of deeper. But humans start from a very, very young age to know how to get what they want, in terms of being able to say the right thing, to use the right words, to manipulate the situation to get exactly what they need. And then, of course, as we grow, we're kind of taught out of that, very much in the same way that we're taught out of creativity. We're told to sit down, to shut up, to stay still. But the reality is that we use our bodies all the time. Now, in this environment, a very good way of doing that is by using the proximity of the camera and the proximity of the microphone to mimic those elements. So if I want to be conspiratorial, I can come in close to the camera. And it's like you and I are having this conversation just on our own. Or if I want to just whisper to you, I could be using my microphone. I'd place it in a way I could, and I can get in close to the microphone and I can speak in a way that might be just a whisper. Or I can be expansive and use the whole of the space. You'll notice that my arm disappeared there because I'm using a little bit of software called OBS, which is an open source broadcast software, which allows me to have this background here behind me, and it allows me to do some quite cool technical things. the better you can get, the more opportunity that you have to become technically adept, to understand how we as humans interact and behave, the better the level of connection you're going to have. I could talk forever on this particular subject, but our time is limited, so I'll leave it right here, and I look forward to answering any questions as we move forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Greg, thanks for that. That's really fascinating. I have to say, the science really of presentation, and I think undoubtedly we will return to that in the discussion. And just a word on that: if people have got questions, as usual, if you can post them in the questions box, if you put your company name there, I'm happy to give you a name check as well. So please, please do that. And we'll pose those questions after all of our panelists have actually spoken. But thank you very much indeed, Greg, and you'll be pleased to know that the sound was absolutely pitch perfect. Mellifluous, I think, is a word that comes to mind when I hear your voice. Anyway, next panelist is Catherine Llewellyn. Catherine's not in New Zealand, she's actually in Wakefield. Heard earlier that Greg had spent some of his formative years, and so it's always interesting to find out these different connections from people. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit. It can be a very useful technique that you use in gaining empathy with people. But Catherine is the corporate communications manager for the UK for Arcadis, who are one of the leading consultancy firms on the planet, actually. And Catherine's got extensive experience working in communications in the built environment sector. She's worked for McDonald in the past, for AECOM, and for British Land. And she's also, like myself, worked in journalism as well. So, that makes her pretty damn good as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Catherine, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andy. And yeah, it was great listening to you, Greg, as well. So many great advice there. Okay, so in times of uncertainty in the market, usually when comms team are valued the most, as they guide staff and clients through the storms and give clarity when it's needed the most. The right message really can make all the difference. So right now, we're relating to our colleagues and clients on a much more human level. We're seeing people's living rooms, and kitchens in my case, children, pets, and it's bringing people together and opening conversations. It's part of the comms team's role to make clients and customers feel at ease and to reassure people that despite most people being at home, we're still winning work, and it really is business as usual. If you leave a vacuum, people tend to fill it with their worst fears. So even when you can't give people all the information, at least tell them what you can. Now is the time to show the world that you are important, that you're helping with the response and working on projects that are going to keep the country moving. But there's a fine line. Don't be seen to be ambulance chasing or gloating about your achievements when people are suffering. While your company may be winning projects and business continues, we're at the beginning of a new dawn, which may force major changes to many organisations. Revenue from advertising and print circulations, which is still the main source of income for many magazines, has been hit hard by the cancellation of events. The increasing barriers on face-to-face networking pose an enormous challenge for many. A lot of companies rely on the annual circuit of trade shows and exhibitions to network and build customer relations. For smaller businesses especially, used to getting new customers through word-of-mouth referrals or on the strength of their reputation, their loss will be significant. Companies have to think differently about how they get their messages out there without events and conferences. But the new way of running events could bring opportunities. Existing trends, particularly digital, are being accelerated. Changes are all happening so fast that companies may find it difficult to keep up with exploiting new strategies, but those who do will be in by far the best position. Conferences can be much more inclusive. Before, it would often be only the senior people from companies who could attend conferences, but now they can be attended by students and also retired people with an interest in the subject. Organisations are also able to secure a wider range of speakers without the time constraints of travelling to events. Also, with many companies spending 60% of their marketing budgets on events, this money could be used to try something new. The focus has shifted to different forms of communication, like podcasts and webinars like today. That change has happened rapidly, and it needs to be carefully considered within the entire comms strategy. It's not just a case of doing a webinar. It needs to speak to a clearly defined business need or proposition, and be thought about and planned as carefully as any real-life event. So here at Arcadis, we recently held a virtual event called Arcadis City of 2030 Accelerator, powered by Techstars. The programme brought together companies from around the world working on innovations to help make the cities of the future smarter. It was the second year of the event, and last year it was held in a beautiful church in Amsterdam. But delivering the event virtually meant that it was open to more people who may not be able to travel there. In the next few months, potential clients will be less open to the idea of meeting face-to-face, and no one really knows how long that will be for. It's important to be adaptable. It's not the time to say, I'm not a social media person. You may have to start making introductions via social media platforms and forming relationships online. Companies are looking more seriously at their social media strategies and turning to functions such as LinkedIn Live to get their stories out there. As long as businesses approach the shift to digital marketing strategically, there's no reason why it should just serve as a temporary fix. Looking at your digital marketing strategy seriously will also make companies more resilient in the future. Collaboration can look different during this time, as we are sharing more online than ever before through apps such as Teams. People are sharing work more during the process of delivering it, rather than just the end result. When the team is all around the country, this emergence of having regular video calls is bringing people together like never before. And finally, leadership. Leaders need to be more visible than ever. Now is the time to get your leaders media trained so that they feel comfortable talking in front of the camera to address your company, both internally and externally. Leaders need to be transparent, human, and not overpromise. As always, it's crucial that leaders have comms people in the room when making big decisions. Okay, so that's my bit.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I think Catherine's raised a few very interesting points there. And I think this thing about media training is very interesting because everyone will have noticed in the recent period, whether it's on the radio or on the news, you basically see people being interviewed in the back kitchens or in the front rooms, because obviously of social distancing and everything else. So I think the barriers to actually people appearing on the news have actually been lowered a little bit by necessity, obviously. So I think in that situation, on the one hand, it gives you the opportunity to get media coverage that you maybe wouldn't have had in the past. It certainly gives you the opportunity to get high profile media coverage. I've seen people that I actually know who've been on the Newsnight program. You've heard them on, on radio, on national radio, not just local radio. So those opportunities are increasing. And I think it's beholden on, people involved in communications, as Catherine said, to be in the room in the first place, but also to understand that these opportunities are actually going to be there, because there are, and that obviously fundamentally can actually lead to potential business opportunities going forward as well. So thanks for all those points, Catherine, and obviously we'll pick some of them up in the discussion as well. Our next speaker is Jamie Gordon. Jamie is the Director for Infrastructure and Energy at the communications specialist BECG, who we're delighted are sponsoring today's event. Jamie's got 25 years experience of delivering strategic communications programs and is currently advising on some of the UK's largest projects, from high-speed rail to offshore wind farms and major highways projects. So he kind of knows what he's talking about, as all of our speakers do, when it comes to communications and when it comes to working in this particular sector. So Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andy. Rather weirdly, after that introduction, I'm actually going to say that for someone that works in communications, I think actually that the biggest opportunity through digital communications actually, for the infrastructure point of view, might not involve directly talking to people. It's actually taking systems and getting them to communicate with one another digitally about how people behave, and hence driving behavioural change with that level of information and detail. I suppose from an infrastructure point of view, the biggest game changer we have on the horizon, probably even with C19 going on, is still net zero. You know, we have deadlines of 2050 and things like this that are going to be hugely challenging. And it's how we access digital data and communicate that knowledge between systems that's really going to be crucial to the system. Now, as some of you in the engineering side of things may well be aware, one of the biggest challenges we have when it comes to energy and transport is how things operate together. You see these scaremongering headlines in things like the Daily Mail about wind farms being paid millions to turn off, and part of the challenge the system has is in balancing the unpredictability of renewables, which is obviously the way we have to move forward if we are going to become a net zero country. But realistically, there is no pill we can take overnight. It's going to be a slow process. And looking at the kind of David Brailsford 1% principle of doing lots of little things rather than one big thing, if we are going to achieve that balancing act, it's going to be systems constantly communicating, the system being aware that somebody is coming home and about to plug their EV and demand on a nanosecond basis across the entire population is going to be crucial for the energy system not to fall over, not to either produce too much or too little. And that data is there. We have a hugely digitized community at the moment, probably more so post-COVID. And it means that we can actually use that information to help net zero, whether it be turning off every freezer in the supermarket network for 2 seconds, just to balance out the system as you know, loads of people turn on their kettles during halftime of the FA Cup. Things like that is going to be crucial to keep that base load going. And one of the big challenges we've got is how people are going to change the way they interact with the infrastructure. EVs are coming. That's going to be both a great storage solution for energy, but also a major draw. So mapping how people behave on that is going to be crucial. Social values, the holy grail of modeling. We've seen how additional data and data processing has improved weather forecasting. I remember the days of maps on TV and extremely vague forecasting. Now I can get on my phone and they always seem to get it right virtually by the hour. And that's obviously the additional data. We now have that level of data through the amount of communication tools and some of the apps that people are now using. There's quite an interesting one out at the moment called Hello Lamppost, which is an app it's almost like kind of online graffiti. Lampposts, I know New Zealand is quite big on this tool. Lampposts and other civic monuments and fire hydrants and things have a number on, and you can type that number into Hello Lamppost and things will come up about the area that people have posted. And lots of community communications now are using digital platforms like that. But at the end of the day, if you're going to build something in the infrastructure world, you need to consult. You need to get consent. And on the whole, most big infrastructure projects will involve a lot of consultation work. And we're finding now that more of that obviously has had to be done virtually. More people on broadband, silver surfers are now a pretty commonplace, especially post-COVID. And there's more automation available as well. We've got fantastic chatbots we've started to use that really use IE to constantly improve. And the systems now are so much better and improved than they were when I started off in the ad world, where The only data you really had access to was behavioral data gained through things like loyalty cards. And you would have to make a high level of assumption. You might, if you were doing a mailing, trying to stress the benefits of, let's say, a high-speed rail system. I know we've got some probably HS2 people on the call. This is not referencing HS2, it's hypothetical. But if you had an older group, you might have to change your messaging accordingly. Your message hierarchy probably wouldn't be about commuting. It might be about taking cars off the road. And to achieve that, you would have to buy in a list, maybe Saga or something like this. Nowadays, you can do it with data you're getting off social media. And we recently ran a campaign. We were approached by a clinical trust. They had a big issue looking at obesity among the young. So we did a deal with local gym chain. And basically, we targeted people who on hot, nice weather days were tweeting or social media active, talking about what was on telly at the time. So we knew that they weren't out, they weren't doing things, and we offered them a discount to go to the gym within the next 2 hours. Now, the gyms loved it because they don't tend to get a lot of usage during the good weather periods. And it was hugely successful. But you're getting that level of data because it's behavioral at that exact moment. So rather than being confined to certain publications, you're actually basing it on not what people are reading, but what people are saying, what people are doing. And that level of behavioral information really means you can target your message and segment it. So you could talk about commuting to those, or the benefits of commuting on high-speed rail to people you know are commuting, and a different hierarchy of messaging to those you know aren't, based on some of the traffic they're producing. And this big data is amazing. How it's going to change, I know Greg referred to the offices. We're now looking at, will the office be 4 walls or will it be 4 sides to a screen? People are making their homes look more like offices. People have different backgrounds. Actually, this, some of you may have worked out, is not a background at all. It's something I found in my attic just before COVID-19 kicked in. And certainly in Scandinavia, they're looking at kind of 2-door homes. So 1 door is your office and 1 door is your home. The whole world is very much changing. So what we have to do is look at communications holistically. How much information we've got, what tools we can use, how can we be more collaborative? We're designing certain collaborative workshops at the moment. So some of the big engineering practices working together on some of the huge schemes in the UK at the moment can still do collaborative risk workshops and things like this remotely using some of the tools we're defining, where they can exchange post-it notes and the likes like that. Supply chain modeling, all based on information and communicating digitally, and far better targeting. And the opportunities are vast, and really the infrastructure sector has the ability to make probably more of the digitized community world because of that data and the ability to talk direct in a segmented and highly targeted way to our audiences than many other sectors. So hopefully moving forward, we'll see some rapid change. And I think coming out of C19, we'll all be doing extremely well if we follow those principles. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much indeed, Jamie, and some really interesting insights there, particularly about this issue of data and how we use it, and also how we actually have that interaction. Particularly interested in some of the stuff that you touched on there about consultation work, because I know the BECG have been involved in developing some very interesting kit to enable better interactions in relation to digital consultation, which I think, you know, is probably something we should be doing anyway if we're serious about reaching out to people when we want their opinions on infrastructure developments and potential schemes. But it's really kind of come into its own really during the course of this crisis, where obviously meetings just haven't been able to take place at all. So, you know, I think some interesting things to ponder there. There's some really interesting questions coming through on the questions panel, and I'm lining those up to ask our panelists quite shortly. But before we do that, we move on to our next speaker now, who is Derek Arden. Derek is a negotiation expert. Like Greg, he's spoken and addressed and interacted with people in many countries around the world, and he has significant experience of working in corporate negotiations, including in the built environment and infrastructure sector. And I think, you know, Derek will talk to us about a number of issues, but I think he'll certainly give us the benefit of some of his insights in relation to how the world of negotiations is shaping up, particularly in relation to this new normal that we all find ourselves in. So Derek, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Andy, and thank you for tuning in. I want to share a few of my experiences and a few of my recent experiences with you. And the first thing I want to talk about is, number one, nothing's changed in the world of negotiation. Actually, lots of people aren't very good negotiators. An interesting statistic I came up with from doing a study was that 62% of professionals didn't feel confident in negotiating. So number one, I'm going to go through the basics. Number two, I'm going to go through the issues with digital negotiations, virtual negotiations. And then I've got my 5 biggest mistakes that people make. So I hope this will be interesting for you. So starting off, key issues with negotiation. Number one, preparation. There's no substitute for it, and yet people spend 10 minutes, that's the number, preparing for a negotiation. Number two, make sure you know what you want. What's your best position, target position, walk away position that you work out before you go into the meeting. You discuss it with your team, and even on Zoom, you must have timeouts, you must have breaks, you must talk to people, but be careful, because there's a court case last week where someone left the Zoom on, and actually the lawyer said to the court, she's a liar, and he didn't know that they were, and this was reported in the Financial Times. So be very careful with that. Then you've got to ask good questions, then you've got to listen, and you've got to listen acutely, and you've got to listen to the body language. And yes, you can read the body language on Zoom or on virtual environments, but you have to have somebody with you to do that, because the way the brain works is when you're concentrating really hard, you won't see the nuances of the body language. Then you need to understand the psychology of negotiating tactics, and a lot of people don't understand that. I've got a tactic being played on them at that time, and then after that, you've got to understand the psychology of bargaining, conditional bargaining. If I do this for you, then you do that for me. And generally, you can't do these things on your own, ladies and gentlemen. You need a team. You need to be working with people. Apply the 80-20 rule. 20% of the negotiations you do this year, next year, will provide 80% of the results. So remember, a good negotiation increases your bottom line. So I have prepared just a few issues that I see on virtual negotiations. And Andy, I think we can all see that. Everybody can probably see that. I'll just move that back a little bit. First of all, the setup. I recommend my clients arrange the meeting so they're in control, like Andy is, of the buttons. So therefore, if you want to record it, you can. You get the recording. Obviously, you have to seek permission from the other side that you're recording it. That's fine, but you want to be in control. You've got immediate access to the recording, and you can play back what was said and what wasn't said. Number two, you need a briefing with your team. They need to understand what you're going to do. So yes, you have got someone to watch the body language. They might be halfway around the world. Does that matter? Of course it doesn't. As long as you take a break and a timeout and switch the machine off, so there's no doubt there'll be a mistake, and then you can call them, come back, set up the meeting 5 minutes later, whatever you do. I was talking to the chief operating officer of a company where people are represented today. He's one of my clients, and he said he was on a mediation on Tuesday, and the person that was doing the mediation didn't know how to work the controls. So there was an awful lot of time wasted on working out the controls, putting people in breakout rooms, and etc. Be as much in charge of this as you can. Number three is be professional. The setup, the way you come across, the way you dress. Yes, dress is important. The background that you have, etc. You want to be calling the shots. Dress for success. Subliminally, you will look more important. Number 4 is take a time out. Don't forget to take that break, take that time out. When you're in the middle of the negotiations, leading the negotiations, you can't see, feel, hear what people might be saying, what they're not saying. So take a break. I think a flip chart's really important because you can write down and record what's been agreed on the flip chart. Everybody can see it. It's there, and therefore there's no misunderstanding. Scrabbling around and making your own notes on a board is actually not as professional as it should be. Remember, there's a time lag. Remember, there's Zoom fatigue, internet fatigue, big issue at the moment. Lots of people are talking about it, but people don't get it. I was talking to someone, he said he had 14 hours last Monday on Zoom. So they're the things that we need to add to the basics of negotiation, and statistically, people aren't always as good as they should be. So review your own negotiations, have a little think about how you do it, how you come across, and how the people that work for you in your team, upwards, downwards, or whatever. When I was negotiating, sometimes the internal negotiations, I worked for a very large company, were more difficult than the internal negotiations. So I just want to summarize with the mistakes that people seem to be making in 2020. Number 1, they're not doing enough planning for the negotiation, thinking about where the other side's coming from. What do they want? What's their agenda? Setting up their own team and briefing the team properly. Because if I ask what I call a Columbo question, you remember Lieutenant Columbo, a dumb is smart question, I don't mind my team answering it, which is always a big danger. I want to hear what they're saying and where they're, so I can feel where they're coming from. People forget what's the best position I can achieve, what's my real target position, what's my walk away position, and if I do walk away, what's the alternative position? In other words, what do I do with the resources if we walk away, or do we end up in court, which is going to be one of the biggest issues that's going to be going on. And by the way, the court hasn't got enough time. Do you really want it to go to court? Some cases will take 2 years to come to court because of the COVID issues. Asking great questions, really listening with all bits of kit that we've been given, 2 ears and 2 eyes to listen to, and watching the body language. When you ask a difficult question and the client goes, yeah, Derek, that's absolutely right. Just remember, Pinocchio's nose grew every time he told a lie. So it wasn't that they just had an itchy nose. They had an itchy nose because they were uncomfortable with what they were saying. You won't see anyone on television, and Greg will confirm this, rubbing their nose, because they would never be believed by any of the audience. And if a politician does that, he's dead. Beware of tactical ploys. There's 35 negotiation tactics that I've listed. The key ones are good guy, bad guy linked to higher authority, putting pressure on the time to get a deal, not taking timeouts, dumb is smart, and flinching. Wow, you're joking. At that price, I couldn't possibly do that. And lastly, trading concessions, conditional bargaining. And what that is all about, as I'm sure you know, is that you trade concessions. If I do this for you, what will you do for me? If we agree to that clause, what clauses will you give me? Can we sort this out quickly? And then just asking really good, high quality questions, such as, how can we resolve this? What do you need to resolve this? When you do ask those questions, ladies and gentlemen, everybody knows, but doesn't always do, you shut up. You zip this and you wait for them to answer. Now, I can tell you that holding silences can be more difficult on the virtual backgrounds than it is face-to-face, where you're getting the 3-dimensional information coming back. So they're the mistakes. Think about how you do it digitally. It's more difficult. You want a better result. And never, ever forget the fundamentals of negotiation. which encompass all the issues of communication skills and all the issues of psychology. My name's Derek Arden. Thanks for inviting me into your house.
Thanks very much, Derek, for those insights there. And we've got a few questions coming in on this question of negotiations, which I'll get to in a minute. So just to say to people, keep your questions coming in. But I've got a first question I'm going to ask actually for the whole of the panel to kick things off. And that question is from Sakshi Tiwari. And I think it's something that sort of speaks to the fact that we've got in this new environment. Sakshi asks, what could be the best way to ease people into embracing the new roles of the digital world? For example, if a leader is a very good storyteller, but they feel reluctant to do that online. Catherine, you spoke about this concept of, you know, we just have to embrace the online world. We've got to get stuck into social media in the position that we're in now. So, you know, if we do have someone who's really good, but actually they shy away from this kind of stuff a little bit, how do we get over that? What do we do? How have you done it?
A lot of it is practice. So I guess, so I think it makes leaders a lot more human. So a lot of the time people will only see them walking past, and, you know, it might be a bit, you know, some people might be intimidated by their leaders, but for once, I think it's good to remind leaders that this is the first time that people can actually see into their homes. I think at the same time, it's quite important to be really careful as a leader to not be, you know, shown to have a massive house. I think it's really important to show that you know, keep in one room perhaps, because especially at this time, if a lot of people have been furloughed, people might not feel great seeing someone in like their mansion. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But yeah, get lots of practice. Maybe start with things that aren't live and just keep going at it. And, you know, and I think get media trained, get all the tips that you can. And I think a lot of the kind of advice that people have been saying today on the best way to, you know, come across as human and to be relatable. And also to be, like, above all, to be completely transparent. So, you know, if there's something that, you know, it might not be what everyone wants to hear, it's still really important to say it, because if you don't say it now, rumors get around. So that's particularly internal. But I think it's really important to be always transparent.
To work with a few leaders in your time, some of whom have been better than others. I mean, how do you, particularly at the present time, get them to embrace this sort of, you know, tech world, and especially when they might be a little bit uncomfortable about it?
I think it's showing them the value of it.
Sorry, that was to Greg. That was to Greg, that question. Greg. Sorry, Catherine, I'll come back to you in a minute. Did you
Thanks,
get
Andy.
that?
And I'll continue on from Catherine's train of thought as well. And really, right from the initial point, it's practice. Derek made the point, you know, in terms of negotiation as well, is that if you want a great outcome, you've got to put the preparation time in to achieve that. One of the challenges that we have in this environment is that we've got to become comfortable in being uncomfortable. We don't, when we speak face to face, we don't see ourselves. But when we're in this environment, we have that opportunity to be able to see ourselves, and we're very, what's the word for that? We don't like looking at ourselves. We're always going to find the things that we don't like.
Don't we? People hate that. They can't.
Completely and utterly. And so the process is get comfortable with that. Forget looking at yourself as well. Use the camera. So one of the tips that I will often say is find a picture of a loved one and place that picture just behind the camera. So every time you look at the camera, it changes your physiology. You literally have a completely different state when you're looking at the camera, and you can see in your peripheral vision that individual. And the other factor, if you have a leader who's a great storyteller but is uncomfortable in this particular space, is use interviews. Take the opportunity to take them away from having to face the camera, and use the opportunity to be able to create the story or co-create that story. There's a lot of different techniques to be able to do that. You could pre-film it, or you could do it live. but it's just playing with it, finding a way that works for that specific individual.
Okay, thanks for that. Jamie, have you got any observations on that? How do we actually make sure that, I suppose our best people are actually embracing this kind of technology and approach?
I was on mute. Yes, I suppose training. There you go. Train people in how, and actually, Greg probably this might be something that he provides, and we provide for our client as well. Media training is crucial. Get them in front of somebody who's going to grill them, so their confidence increases that they do know the answers. That these people are senior for a reason. And so usually it's just a case of making sure that they know their stuff, and that could be, well, getting them in front of an ex-journo or somebody and mimicking a fairly hard-nosed interview, because then when the actual interview happens, or the engagement or whatever it is online, it's likely to be a lot easier, and they're going to feel extremely comfortable, very much in their comfort zone, and know their stuff. Make sure they've been briefed, obviously, if it is something that's going to go live and in the public domain. So that briefing notes and making sure that they're compliant with whatever the position statement is about a project or a corporate positioning is crucial. You do get senior people, unfortunately, sometimes going off the reservation. And that can cause a lot of issues. So make sure that they know what they're supposed to be saying and they stick to it. From an internal perspective, going back to what Catherine was saying, I think it is important that they are seen to not be in their ivory towers. But it's quite interesting how the digital world has leveled that playing field a lot. I mean, we saw a change a few years back in the 60s of how offices were designed, so you wouldn't have management up on the top level and more open plan offices. But actually recent research shows that all that's happened is you've had a huge drop in the number of face-to-face meetings because of that, because people do appreciate a level of secrecy. And in open plan offices, face-to-face meetings drop on average 70%. What we're now seeing is they're replacing that with emails. They will email somebody that sits opposite them. Now, the digital world allows people to have meetings like this and still have a background, a chat facility where they can chat with other people on the screen. And so it's important that you're aware of that. I'm not saying you necessarily have to monitor it as an organization, but you just have to make sure that is facilitated. People are allowed to have those back channels to be able to make the most of collaboration in this kind of COVID world that we currently have, and as Greg said, the new normal.
Thanks, Jamie. Derek, you've obviously worked with people in a negotiation setting, and there'll obviously be the CEO who's got to be there, or the key decision maker. And obviously you want to make sure that they're going to be the best that they can be. But is there ever a case for having other people in the room with maybe different skills who can actually complement that key decision maker? Do you have any views on that?
Well, there's two things, Andy, there that you mentioned. First of all, you might not want the key decision maker there, because Boris Johnson certainly won't be in Brussels until about November negotiating the fine details. He'll be sending his team, etc., so they can always use higher authority. Higher authority is a key issue in negotiations, and weak negotiators think, I need to be able to make the decision there and then. Maybe not. To keep the other side honest, you might want to be playing good guy, good cop, bad cop, higher authority, etc. And the higher authority shouldn't be the CEO always. It should be the committee, the operations committee, the return on investment committee, etc., etc. So I just wanted to say that. But if you have got a team, you then clearly need the key players who need to be briefed, and the key players might be an observer, your right-hand person, and then it might be the experts, particularly in the industries that we're talking to now. You might want an expert there, but you've got to be careful with that expert that they don't talk and give the game away if you're playing the tactics, because you don't want them answering the questions that you want the other side to tell you. And you might also want a note taker, someone to be taking the notes down. So yes, you do, but it has to be managed carefully if you're going to put that title, I'm a professional negotiator, above it. So again, and building rapport and connecting on Zoom is really important as well. But that depends what culture you're in. So I was talking to someone this week who'd done a negotiation in New York and a negotiation in the UAE. In New York, he'd never met the person before, and the first thing they said, Mike, okay, what's the deal? But in the UAE, they said, oh, well, how's the family? How's COVID going? How's the lockdown? What about the football and all that before they got into the negotiations? So it's pretty important these leaders understand these cultural differences as well. And that's what we do as communicators, don't we? We help them with that, etc.
Thanks, Derek. Greg, you were talking there earlier about the importance of sound, and you know, is it a challenge that now we've got all employees presenting and involved in webinars and this, you know, online and video communication? How can we provide the sound tools that you mentioned to all of them? Is cost going to be the big barrier there? And that's a question from Bibiana Estrada Bonilla.
You make a good point. I mean, it's like how long is a piece of string? You can go for the top of the range studio sound setup that's going to cost you thousands of pounds, but with some relatively simple investments, you can do the same process, but for a very small fee. The best way to go about that in terms of audio is to try and find the best quality microphone you can for the least amount of money. And there's a great range of podcast microphones specifically for that, you know, the streaming and gaming and podcast market. In the New Zealand context, they're around about between $150 and $250, and that's around about £100, £125 or something around there for a good microphone, USB microphone, which will just plug straight in. And literally, the headphones that I'm using were something like, you know, down the market for £1. You know, this is not a high-tech piece of kit. The one thing that is different about my sound setup, though, that rather than most, is that I'm using a compressor, and that gives me a noise gate. So currently we've got a thunderstorm that's happening here directly above me. We've got a tin roof and or a steel roof, and it's currently raining very hard. The noise gate means that when I'm not talking, there's no sound. It cuts off. So that's a great piece of kit to get, and you can get these relatively cheaply as well. Again, look at the podcast market. The way I've looked at this is to go, how can I repurpose things that have been made for a different area? Gamers and streamers know this kit. They use it all the time. Now we can take the best of that, transfer it into this realm, and up our game. And we're talking about audio, but I just want to touch on that idea of the virtual background, because as Catherine said, you know, your CEOs, your leaders, your C-suite, we don't want to know that they live in a mansion. And also, not everybody has the flashiest house too. So it gives us the opportunity to democratize all of our dealings remotely. So that's the beauty of it. So finding ways to be able to do this and do it elegantly is a wonderful way forward.
What's interesting about some of this as well is I've noticed, particularly in doing webinars, in speaking on Zoom and everything else. I mean, I'm wearing a headset here, which some people won't wear, but you know, apart from anything else, the volume on my laptop, and I've got a decent laptop, is only at number 20, and it's very, very, and I'm pretty sure that my microphone is okay. Now, some people won't wear them. I insist with a lot of the people that I deal with that they wear these, because actually you can be heard better and you can hear better. And I always find it quite interesting that people will say, oh, I don't like the way I look with those on, and yet they'll show themselves with a crap background behind them, you know, or you know, and I just find it quite amusing sometimes how people don't listen to the communication experts really. And you know, sometimes I think maybe in communications we need to be a bit forward in coming forward and tell people, you know, actually, look, you employ me for a reason, and this is why you need to do it. And I think, you know, that's actually something that, you know, that really, well, it gets my goat a little bit when people come on and you can't hear them and all the rest of it. And all they had to do was actually follow the advice that you were, you know, told, you know, in the first place. I mean, Catherine, how have you found some of your people taking maybe some of that more personalized advice? You mentioned there about, well, don't be, you know, photograph or filmed with your swimming pool in the background, for example. How have you got them to listen to you on that kind of thing? Have they been receptive?
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes people just don't realise, because if that's your norm, I guess you wouldn't think that, you know, the background, and I guess it sometimes just needs someone to point it out to you. But at the same time, I think that because I started my new job during lockdown, so I haven't really met many people face to face, but seeing people's backgrounds. So I've been having a lot of my kind of initial conversations with people, and sometimes you'll see a bike in the background, or you'll see, you know, something that's, and it starts a lot of quite personal conversations which you'd never have in the office, and it might take you years to build up those relationships. And I think it makes forming relationships a lot easier, and I think it'll be the same with clients as well.
I think just on that very point, Jamie, I mean, what Catherine said there about this medium gives us a level of personality and intimacy that you just wouldn't get, you know, generally. Do you think that's had an impact on how we do business in the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Andy. But we've had two major clients projects that have gone into COVID with an active consultation ongoing. So they had to dramatically change the way that was delivered. So we moved away from the typical face-to-face, you know, public events at the village hall and things like this quite rapidly to have a virtual exhibition delivery program, which was very popular, and it got a lot of traffic. And through the use of digital chatbots and being able to move virtually around the room, you could mimic that environment. But you still can't beat face-to-face and meeting somebody that represents a project, because it just personifies and it ups the level of trust. So we realized there was a bit of a vacuum there. So we replaced it with things like this, you know, virtual reality, virtual meetings. We had a series of telephone surgeries by thematic ones, so you could phone and speak with an expert. And as Catherine was mentioned, because actually you were meeting somebody and seeing them in their home rather than in a village hall, if anything, it personified even more, because you could see that bike in the background, and those that were watching that were into cycling could then relate to that individual who was personifying the scheme. So strangely, we actually found the trust levels, some of the feedback we got, and we do quite a lot of core research around some of the events we do, actually showed that the trust levels were in some ways with certain audiences higher using that environment. So it's very informative, and we will, even post-COVID, we will, I think, continue to deliver this, because it's fantastic to reaching out for certain groups that can't attend public events, like young families who are just too busy, or the hard to reach groups that are maybe have mobility problems. So it's going to be a default now that we always deliver that as an option.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that, Derek. Your observations on that, on this, you know, increased intimacy versus, you know, the need still for that, you know, serious business approach, business negotiations. I mean, is it just something that we just have to learn to work with and live with going forward? I know you've, you know, you have I think a weekly chat show, and you have people from all over the world coming on that chat show, quite high-powered people who are quite prepared. Not exactly sitting there in the pajamas, but certainly just sitting there in quite an informal setting. You know, does that, you know, what's your view on that? Does that have an effect on the message they're trying to get across?
I think it does. I think it has a big message, Andy, and I think people aren't taking this seriously enough. They think, oh, because I'm working from home, it's okay to, you know, be dressed down. It's okay not to think about what shirt I'm going to wear. For a start, if you've got a patterned shirt, it doesn't show up well. So I wear a white shirt, a pink shirt, or a blue one. I changed it to a white shirt today because it was a bit dark in my office that I got set up. This is a little tiny room that I've set up, as you can see. Trust is really important. That's why I wear these non-reflective glasses that I get from my optician. So again, I've got a light right by me, no reflection whatsoever. They cost £300. My optician is a friend of mine. I negotiate with him. He gives me free glasses. I take him to Arsenal. That's called a soft pound negotiation, where money doesn't change hands. I hope the tax authorities are not listening to this, because they probably want that declared as a taxable benefit. But
I think that's a charitable benefit going to Arsenal, isn't it, Derek?
Andy, you're wicked. You're wicked. I'll get you back to that one of these days. The thing is, if you can't see someone's eyes, you can't trust them. And therefore, if they're looking down like I'm looking now at you, as opposed into the camera, into the eyes of the people, the one person that's watching me as I take Greg's tip, therefore they want to be able to see your eyes. They want to see your eyes clearly. Actually, it was in the 80s, IBM forbade their salespeople to wear glasses, because they didn't want any distractions from seeing their eyes and the trust. So that's the trust question. So there's some very simple, basic things that people can do, but they have to put themselves out. I get set up an hour before I interview people on my live chat show, and they're all on YouTube. If anyone wants to go to my YouTube channel, I've had some really international negotiations and everything else. I need time. And the one that went wrong, and I'll share you, out of 38, I didn't do enough preparation for. Preparation. The negotiations that go wrong, people haven't prepared for it. They haven't got their team set up. They haven't thought about where the other side's coming from. They haven't prepared the questions, etc., etc. So we, because we're good, and a lot of people watching this take these things for granted. You can't. And also, you've got to coach and mentor the people that are on your team, so they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. You know, I've asked those Columbo questions, and I've had people in my team answer them, and I've realized what a mistake I made. And you learn by your mistakes. The best learning is by your mistakes on negotiation, on influencing, on persuasion, on anything. Hope that answers the question, Andy.
Cheers, Derek. Thanks. Another question here from Barry Avis, and it kind of continues on from this whole concept of, you know, the right people delivering the right message. He says that, does the panel think that the move to a more direct communication process with Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc., does that pose a greater risk to the quality control of the desired message? Because there might be less controls and barriers between poor communicators and clients. And I don't know whether, Greg, you've got a view on that one.
Yeah, actually, as you were asking that question, the first thing that sprang to mind was it's actually an opportunity. It's a really good opportunity for organizations to bring people in close, to actually mentor people, to nurture them, and to look at where the gap in the skill set is. And if you've got a situation where you've got members of your team that you have varied levels of trust with, then this is a perfect situation to highlight that and to be able to address it. So I'd suggest that the situation we have is actually a very positive one in this light, but it does take some what could be some fairly uncomfortable conversations. And you know, I'd suggest perhaps catching up with Derek to have a chat around that as well, about how best you could potentially handle those situations. But yeah, I think it's a great opportunity.
Thanks for that, Jamie. What's your view on that? I mean, you know, Zoom, Teams, it's with us now. You know, it's going to be used continuously. Are you at all concerned about, you know, the fact that there are less controls and barriers, but do we just have to get on with it?
Not really. I think I agree with Greg. It is an opportunity, and particular for junior levels within any team, because they can be invited to meetings, which they probably wouldn't. They'd stand out if they came into the meeting room with the clients and there wasn't a seat because you hadn't informed them they were coming. Obviously, on a Zoom or Skype, they can just join in and you know, either be there visually or their web camera can be suppressed. But that is an environment that they'll be used to. Socially, you use Zoom, you use these tools, and certainly the young probably use it more than people my age sociably at the moment. And so it's an environment they feel comfortable in, far more comfortable in that than walking into a boardroom with a big table. To them, it's the pub. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to have more junior people in meetings, learning from their presence in those meetings. And I think also it means that you'll have fewer situations where senior management can actually say, I'm afraid I don't have that answer. I'll have to wait to get back to the office and speak to John about it. John should be in the room, and there's no reason why not. He hasn't had to get on a train. So I think it gives knowledge sharing amongst a team a fantastic opportunity for that.
Catherine, from a comms point of view, have you found that to be the case in Arcadis? Has it kind of democratized, if I can use that word, much more the communications reach in your organization?
Yeah, I think so. I think as you know, people, it means that teams who are all around the country who wouldn't usually be able to get involved in, you know, like water cooler moments and things like that are actually much more involved now. And I think it really will be good for the environment as well, because less people are going to be traveling to around the country to join meetings when they can join over Zoom. And I think this has shown how well it works. And I think, yeah, I think there's, you know, the odd problem with, I think it can be really frustrating if you've got a bit of a lag with internet. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed on a country level. I think there's, you know, a lot of digital inequality that really needs to be addressed. And I think that's become clearer than ever at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a specific question here for Derek in relation to negotiation, and you know, maybe Greg might have a view on this as well. And this has come from Ian in Warrington, and Ian asks, is it really negotiation, or have both sides already decided before the meeting? And if so, how do you get a win-win? Derek?
Well, it's not a negotiation if both sides have decided before the meeting, and everything's flexible and everything moves around. And so, you know, whatever you're negotiating, I mean, the definition of negotiation is when two sides want to agree something and they have a difference of opinion, which is why knowing how to handle conflict and knowing some conflict styles is very important. I just wanted to mention one thing that Greg mentioned, and he demonstrated it can be really effective to lean in, drop your tone of voice, and ask a really difficult question. So what are your objectives, Sir in Warrington, for asking that question? Now, I wasn't doing that deliberately, but if I said that, what were your objectives for asking that question? Listen to that, and that sounds aggressive, but you can ask a reasonably aggressive question without doing that. So we're apart. First thing is to find out how far we are apart. Good question for that is, how far are we apart? You might ask that gently. Yeah, and therefore you can start negotiating if you know how far you are apart. So then can you bring in extras, variables, things like new business, payment terms, etc., which aren't necessarily in the price, or contract terms for engineers and constructors, etc. And then see how much you can move towards each other by trading concessions. And one great question you can ask is, if it's getting a little bit out of hand, we do want a win-win, don't we? Now, in communications, that's a statement followed by a yes tag question. What that does is make them either answer, yes, of course we do, or watch the body language, or they go, oh, yeah, of course we do, yeah, we do, which is a definite no, isn't it? Because there were 6 signals there in body language that you could have seen. I moved back, folded my arms, rubbed my nose, shook my head slightly, etc. Now, someone needs to pick that up, because generally, if you're doing a job like Greg's doing, it's really difficult when you're broadcasting or whatever to pick up the body language. Now, the broadcasters do because they're good, but generally you don't see things like that. Yeah, of course it's possible to get a win-win, but you have to go out with the goal of getting a win-win, and you need to know how much you can give away, and you need to know what you're going to get back for giving that away. So yes, we all want a win-win, and I'm sure we'll get a win-win in most negotiations. And if we're talking about country or political negotiations, if we don't get a win-win, the results could be catastrophic. We do have a leader in one part of the world at the moment who doesn't appear to do things in a win-win. He appears to want it my way or the highway, but the Senate is trying to deal with that, as we can see. Hope that helps in Warrington.
Thanks, Derek. Greg, any observations on that?
Yeah, I'll concur with Derek. I mean, I thought that's exactly right. That question, we do want a win-win, and it creates in the opposite party, and it's a moment of check. They have to stop thinking emotionally and think factually. Do we want to get a win-win? And if we don't, well, there's a beautiful starting point for the next set of conversations. But it reminded me when you did that, Derek, of a situation where, oh gosh, probably 20 years ago, when I was working in personal safety and security. I have a military background as well. So I was working with an organization for banks and service stations, and I was at this stage a jobbing actor. And so my role was to come in as a robber and absolutely terrify people. And then we would do it again after people had been trained, and we'd go through that process. But one of the aspects of the safety and security training was, if we were in a physically intimidating situation, you've got somebody who is emotionally out of control, to actually stop, take a moment and say, am I safe with you? Just calmly. And the individual, unless they're intoxicated, has to think. They have to stop thinking emotionally and go, am I going to hit this person or not? And they've got to make a choice. And so it's a set point. So from negotiations, if I could take that as my little experience, but going back to what you said, Derek, I mean, that's absolutely correct. It's taking a moment, stopping, and using that behavior. We're very good at, we know it, we can see it. But as you say, in this environment, having two people, having a watcher and having the negotiator is a really valuable thing as well. You want to be able to see it from a couple of different angles.
Andy, I teach people that they must take someone with them. I say it's almost a disgrace not to take it. You're not doing your job properly, because you've got to resource. And what Greg's talking about is a pattern interrupting psychology, where you actually stop the person in their tracks and to do it. And you could do that in a negotiation by saying, look, I need a coffee break. I need to go to the bathroom or whatever, because it's getting a bit out of hand. And what you're actually doing is making them stop and think and make some progress, without saying, we're not making much progress here, you need to get your act together, or something ridiculous like that, which will set the world alight rather than calm it down. So as the leader of the negotiation, we're leading the other side into that win-win as well, hopefully, as opposed to what Monsieur Barnier appears to be doing at the moment, sometimes leaking things into the British press to wind up the press, to put the government under pressure on the timescales on the EU negotiations. And I hope we've got the right people negotiating. I've sent them copies of my book, so never mind. And I did get a reply, so that's good.
Jamie, what have you found working with your clients in this sort of current situation? Well, I mean, have they been pretty receptive to, dealing with, some of these, shall we say, newer communications mediums by necessity, I suppose? Or have you had to give them, certain nudges here and there? How have you found their sort of approach been?
On the whole, very receptive. I mean, you alluded to it in the question, actually, Andy, that in some ways they have to. There are, within the consultancy world for infrastructure, there are compliancy requirements, which means they have to consult, and they have to show evidence that they've consulted with people and had consideration to their views. So in the COVID-19 world, there's been no choice but to use digital platforms to achieve that. I think, going back to what Derek was saying, one of the things that does unfortunately remove is that body language factor, which is crucial. Many years ago, I used to run an ad agency in previous life in Poland, and my Polish was reasonably limited, and I would walk out of meetings with a totally different view of what the client's attitude was, but towards a particular concept than my Polish colleagues, and as often as not, I was proven right because I was reading the body language and not the words. Now, obviously, that's slightly reduced when you're using platforms like Zoom because you are only seeing the face. But at the same time, it's far better than not being able to reach out at all. So on the whole, clients have embraced it. What they've also embraced is the ability to use technology and the data you get from digital platforms to inform. We're using a lot more IE to develop communication options like chatbots and variations in response. So, you know, a letter can be very quickly automated using keywords to attach to certain FAQs and compile a highly tailored letter virtually automatically. And so, you know, there are benefits to consultation data being provided digitally because it gives you an automation option.
I think as well what you're saying about, you know, body language, the same goes for words sometimes when written down, because you can get an email from someone that sounds really abrupt, but it might be from someone who's just in a bit of a rush, you know, a 2-word answer, and you think, oh, you know, is this not good? But then you speak to them on Zoom and, you know, a complete opposite, even if it's just a quick call. And I think that you can get a completely different idea of someone, which you might not have ever had before if you never got a chance to meet those people.
Andy, my advice to people to get a toxic email, and I call them toxic emails, whether they're negotiating or whatever, you get it in your inbox, and this is what you do. You use this magic piece of kit that people don't use very often, and you call them straight away. This will put them right on the back foot straight away, as you said, Catherine, but you've got to clearly set up a Zoom meeting, and you say, oh, hi, Catherine, I've just got your email. I'm curious where you're coming from. Curious is a sensational word to use because no one can get upset with you being curious to understand where they're coming from. So this comes from neurolinguistics, which I've studied to put into the negotiations, but curious is a brilliant word. Get it into your vocabulary. Ask people, you're just curious what the issues are. It throws them totally, and as you said, Catherine, they can't help being nice to you. They usually stutter their words, stutter through the first second or two because they're surprised that you've had the cheek to phone them up. But phone them up, why not? The phone's a fantastic bit of kit, totally underused, totally underused. It's almost redundant.
So we're almost out of time. I've got it's kind of our last question time, but I'm gonna actually ask 2 questions of each of you to answer them both together, and we're going to kick off with Catherine first. I want your top communications tip, given everything that we've been discussing, and just generally, and also what's been your key learning from the way that we've been having to work over the last 3 months. So top tip and key learning. Catherine.
Okay, so top tip, I think that if your company doesn't have a communications team, get them on board now and tell them everything, whether it's good or bad. Don't just tell them the good news. They need to hear absolutely everything, and then they can decide how to approach that news. And I think the thing I've learned the most is to be adaptable. And I think that's probably my biggest takeaway.
Thanks a lot. Greg, top tip and key learning from the recent period.
My top tip for anyone in this particular realm is authenticity, is being yourself. It's very difficult to hide behind an image or a screen here, and the people who can present in this environment and we see who they are, we connect with them so much deeper. It's that level of engagement. It comes down to that behavior. If you're not hiding anything, it's absolutely beautiful. You will connect with them. There's a video that's out there on the internet, and it's the CEO of the Marriott hotel chain right at the start of the COVID period when they lost all of their business and he was in the position of having to lay off people. He stands in front of that camera and it's him, absolutely raw, gutted that he's having to do this, and it's incredibly engaging and effective. It's a terrible situation for them and for the hotel chain. The authenticity comes through absolutely like a million miles an hour. And what I've learned from here is don't sweat the small stuff and play. When I first got this set up, I built it and broke it, built it and broke it, built it and broke it. Don't be afraid to innovate, to try new things, and fail big and fail fast.
Thanks, Greg. Sound advice there. Derek, top comms tip and your key learning from the recent period that we've all had to go through.
Well, my top tip, Andy, is that everything is negotiable and everything is a negotiation. And this is the equipment we're going to be using for the next 100 years on some of our negotiations anyway, internal negotiations, external negotiations. So you need to prepare, and you need to prepare and role play some situations. So before I ran my, or as I've been running my web shows, I've been Zoom bombed. I've had to practice sharing the screen and all sorts of things like that to make it professional. So it's what Greg says there. And my top negotiation tip is one you reminded me of last week. If you don't ask, you don't give the other person the opportunity to say yes to you. And that combines asking, but also turning it around to a motivational state in your own mind. Thanks so much for inviting me, Andy.
Thanks, Derek. And finally, Jamie, your top tip and what have you learned from the last 3 months of, shall we say, unique working environment?
Yeah, I agree with Greg. I think we've been put in a very unusual position where anything goes, and stuff that we wanted to try previously, and maybe the clients, or we've been concerned that the audience, in the form of maybe the public, wouldn't accept it. We've got a clean slate, so we try new stuff and use new stuff, use data. Improve your targeting and your segmentation, your messaging with that data, because there's a hell of a lot more about now, because people are using more social media platforms because of COVID and just the way the market is progressing anyway. And I think my key learning would be forget all geographical boundaries. It's just inbuilt in us that we won't contemplate having a meeting with the Manchester office because we have to get on a train, or having Greg in New Zealand on a call because he's in New Zealand. That's now gone out the window, and we have to change our mindset that we are a global entity. And Catherine's organization has offices in probably 100 countries in the world or something massive. So the ability to knowledge share is now there, and we have to change our mindset and forget where people are sitting. It's more their skill sets and what we want to share with them, and to have opportunities like this to talk and have discussions from around the world, literally.
Absolutely, and I think what a great point to finish on for a communications event. So I just want to thank Greg in New Zealand, Derek in Guildford, Catherine in Wakefield, and Jamie in Richmond upon Thames, and I'm in Durham for anyone who's interested. I also want to thank the communications strategic consultancy BECG for their support for today. Very much appreciate that. I think it's been a really good discussion. We'll write this up. There'll be a report on our website with links to all of our speakers' websites. So if you want to follow up with any of them, then you can do. I think there's some very, very useful stuff that everybody's imparted today. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't give a quick plug for the next installment in our webinar series, which next week this series has been coming out of COVID, and we're now into COVID recovery, we hope, crossing all fingers, particularly from a UK perspective. We can only be envious of where they are in New Zealand at the moment, and be really envious of Greg being able to perform in front of 90 people at a theatre just the other night. But next Friday, at 11 a.m. We've got our webinar on net zero, which has been mentioned today, and people have talked about the prospects for net zero going forward. Have they been given a boost, by this, COVID crisis? And we've got an absolutely fantastic panel next week, including Keith Clark, who's the chair of Forum for the Future. And anyone who's heard Keith Clark speak will know that he can be quite controversial in a good way on these issues. So do tune in next week, same time, same place, at 11 a.m. for After COVID, a boost for net zero. You can find details of all of our forthcoming webinars on our website at infrastructure-intelligence.com. But thanks again to everybody for their input today, and hope you have a great Friday and a fantastic weekend. So tally bye from all of us here. Bye.